Have you ever stayed in a relationship long after your heart knew it was time to go? For many older adults, love in later life can bring both comfort and quiet heartbreak, especially when that love slowly begins to erase who you are. In this video, we follow the intimate story of a man who rediscovered his dignity after being slowly diminished by someone he once trusted. Through gentle reflection and powerful truths, you'll see how aging doesn't mean losing yourself, but sometimes finding your way back. Stay with us, because this story might just mirror something you've quietly lived yourself. The Seduction of Being Seen, Part 1. The seduction of being seen. He hadn't expected to fall in love again at 70. Not really. That part of his life, he thought, had faded with the years, like a coat hung too long in the back of a closet, still present, but no longer worn. Then she appeared, younger, vibrant, with a voice like sunlight and a gaze that landed on him as if he were the only one in the room. Her attention felt like warm rain on dry earth. She called him wise, not old, said his silver hair made him look distinguished, that she admired men who had lived, men with stories etched into their hands and crow's feet near the eyes. For a man who had grown used to being invisible, bypassed in grocery store aisles, interrupted in conversations, smiled at with polite indifference, her presence was disarming. It awakened something inside him he hadn't realized was asleep, the longing to be seen, not for his age or his past or his pension, but as a man still vital, still enough. He began standing a little taller, smiling more, telling stories he hadn't told in years. She listened intently, or so it seemed. She reached for his hand when they crossed the street, left handwritten notes on his kitchen counter. "You make me feel safe," one read. "I feel like I've known you forever," said another. She made him feel like a lighthouse, not a ruin. In those early weeks, he would have done anything for her, and he did. He cleaned her gutters, paid for her car repairs, cooked for her, rearranged his routines to fit hers. When she stayed the night, he laid awake beside her afterward, memorizing the way she breathed in the dark. He told himself, this is what love feels like again. But love, he later realized, has a way of camouflaging itself when it comes too suddenly, and loneliness has a way of dressing up as devotion. He didn't notice when the compliments slowed, not at first. He excused the tone in her voice when she told him he was too sensitive, when she pointed out how often he repeated himself, or how his hearing seemed worse this week than the last. The first time she called him old man, it was a joke. He laughed, but he felt it still. He told himself, she's just teasing. This is what couples do. He tried harder, made her favorite meals, read books she recommended, said yes when he wanted to say maybe later. He didn't notice the pattern yet, how his efforts kept increasing while her warmth quietly decreased. It wasn't that she stopped being kind altogether, that's the thing. She would still, on occasion, wrap her arms around him and say, "You're the only one who truly gets me." She'd kiss his temple and add, "You're so different from men my age." But these moments became rare, just enough to keep him reaching, but never quite enough to satisfy. What he didn't know, what many don't see when it happens to them, is that the need to be seen can become its own kind of blindness. She didn't need to control him with force. She only needed to remind him what it felt like to be admired, and then withhold it when he fell short of her unspoken expectations. It was subtle, so subtle, in fact, that even when he began second-guessing his worth, when he looked in the mirror and saw not a man but a burden, he didn't blame her. He blamed himself for aging, for not keeping up, for believing that someone like her could actually love someone like him. He didn't yet see that what he called love was in truth dependency, that what he felt wasn't affection, it was the hunger of a man who had gone too long without being looked at with care. And like all hunger, it made him vulnerable to the first hand that reached out and offered a taste, even if that taste, in time, would cost him everything else. The beginning of his fall was not the first insult, nor the first criticism. It was the first compliment. He believed more than he believed in himself. Part 2. The erosion you don't notice until it's gone. The signs were small at first, soft enough to overlook, but sharp enough to leave a mark. She began correcting him in public. "You already told that story," she'd say with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You forgot to take your pills again," she asked once at dinner, loud enough for the server to pause. "The sacrifice of love," he chuckled, nodded, brushed it off. Inside, a small thread loosened, but he told himself not to be petty. She's just concerned she cares. Then came the suggestions. "You should dress younger. That sweater ages you, or maybe dyeing your hair wouldn't be such a bad idea." Each remark delivered with a smile, warm enough to feel confusing, cold enough to sting. He adjusted, shaved more often, bought newer shirts, started taking vitamins she swore by. But no matter how he changed, the compliments faded. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she looked at him. Less like a partner, more like someone quietly auditing his flaws. He began to anticipate her judgments before they came, rehearsed what he'd say before opening his mouth, wondered sometimes whether silence was the safer choice. Still, he stayed. Why? Because every now and then, perhaps when he seemed particularly downcast, she'd toss him a crumb of praise. "I don't know why you put up with me," she'd whisper after an argument. Or, "You're such a good man, better than I deserve." And for a few hours, the balance would feel restored. Her hand in his, her laughter warming the room, her eyes softened just enough to remind him of the woman who once made him feel new. But those hours became fewer, their conversation shorter. Her attention, once so generous, began drifting. She scrolled through her phone while he talked, interrupted his thoughts, forgot the small things he told her, called him needy when he tried to explain how that felt. He began waking with a heaviness he couldn't name. It wasn't just sadness, it was self-doubt, calcifying slowly into shame. He'd been told his whole life that love required sacrifice, that being patient, forgiving, and dependable were the pillars of a good relationship. So he kept trying, kept showing up. But what he hadn't learned, what no one teaches older men who find love again, is that sometimes the sacrifice is you, your dignity, your voice, your quiet confidence. One evening, while brushing his teeth, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, not just his reflection, but the posture, the tiredness in his spine, the way his shoulders slumped, not from age, but from apology. That night, she told him she'd be late coming home again. No explanation, no warmth in her voice. He nodded, didn't ask, didn't want to sound insecure, and that was the moment something shifted. The mirror, not loudly, but finally, not in anger, not in drama, just the quiet flicker of a man realizing he'd started measuring his worth by the mood of someone else, the tragedy wasn't that she'd stopped loving him. The tragedy was that he had begun to believe he needed her to feel lovable. It's strange how long we can live inside a slow unraveling before we notice the cold. And it's even stranger how sometimes the person unraveling us smiles when they do it, telling us it's for our own good, that if we were stronger, more confident, less sensitive, things would be easier. He wasn't broken. He was just tired of being small to keep someone else comfortable. And though he didn't know it yet, the quiet decision forming inside him, the one that began not with a declaration but with a breath, was the start of a return. A return, not to who he was with her, but to the man he had been before her, the man who knew how to stand alone, the man who didn't need anyone's permission to feel worthy. Sometimes love isn't lost all at once. It's surrendered inch by inch. But one day, if you're lucky, you wake up and stop giving it away. If you find this content meaningful, give it a like, share it with friends, and support us by subscribing. It means the world. Part 3. The Mirror and the Moment of Truth. It happened quietly, as most turning points do. One morning, he sat alone at the kitchen table, a cup of tea gone cold, her keys missing from the hook. A note read, "Don't wait up." Nothing else. The house was still, not peacefully still, but hollow. He traced the rim of his mug with one finger, listening to the silence settle into the space where warmth used to live. Then slowly he stood and walked to the hallway mirror. It was a habit he'd developed over the past year, checking his reflection, not out of vanity, but out of need, as if to ask, "Is there still someone there?" This time he looked longer, not at the wrinkles or the thinning hair, but at the man behind the eyes, the man who had once built a life with his bare hands, raised children, survived losses, held friends through grief. And yet here he was, unshaven, hunched, shrinking himself for someone who barely looked back. The mirror didn't lie. It never had. But this time, he was finally ready to see what it showed. Not a failure, not an old man past his prime, but someone who had forgotten his own value. A walk alone. The realization wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no anger, just a slow, steady reclaiming of self. That afternoon, he went for a walk alone. The air was brisk, the leaves crunching beneath his shoes. With each step, he felt something return, his pace, his breath, his quiet dignity. He passed a coffee shop they used to visit together and paused. He almost kept walking, but instead he turned in, ordered his usual, sat by the window, no one across from him. And still it felt full. He sipped slowly, noticing the life outside, a young couple arguing gently, a boy laughing as his father spun him in circles, an older woman feeding crumbs to birds. The world hadn't changed. Only his place in it had. For so long he had been orbiting someone else's needs, trying to fit himself into their rhythms. But here, alone, with a warm cup and the gentle noise of the world, he felt the beat of his own life again. That night, when she came home hours later, perfumed, sharp eyes distracted, he was sitting on the couch, a book open on his lap. She barely glanced his way. "You're still up?" He closed the book softly. "Yes." There was something different in his tone, not hard, not cold, just resolved. She hesitated. "Everything okay?" He looked at her for a long moment, not with resentment, not even with sorrow, just clarity. "I think I lost myself somewhere in all this," he said, "and I've decided to find my way back." She blinked, caught off guard. "What does that mean?" It means I need space, real space, not just in this house, but inside myself." She scoffed lightly, as if trying to turn it into a joke. "Come on, don't be dramatic." But he didn't flinch, didn't chase. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to win her understanding, because the decision wasn't about her anymore, it was about him. That night, he didn't sleep in fits and starts. He didn't lie awake, dissecting her tone, her words, her silence. He slept not out of relief, but out of truth. He had finally stopped asking for a seat at a table where he was only fed scraps of affection. And in doing so, he remembered. Dignity doesn't return in applause or praise. It returns in moments like this, when a man looks in the mirror, sees what he gave away. Solitude, the uninvited guest that became a friend. The first week after she left was harder than he expected, not because he missed her laughter or her scent on the pillow or the way she filled a room, but because of how empty the silence felt without her presence to resist. Silence had weight now. It pressed on the windows in the evening. It gathered in the hallway after he turned off the lights. At first, he tried to fill it. He left the TV on while he made dinner. He played the old jazz record she never liked. He rearranged the books on the shelf, though no one would notice the difference. But every night, as he lay in bed, he found himself listening, not for her footsteps, but for the noise that used to drown out the ache inside him. That ache was louder now, but so was something else, clarity. Without her voice telling him who he was, too slow, too sentimental, too behind, he could finally hear his own. He started rising earlier, not because he had to, but because the morning light through the kitchen window was worth waking up for. He made his coffee the old way, strong and dark, not the diluted kind she liked. He pulled out the old camera from the back of the closet, the one he hadn't used in years, took it to the park, took pictures of trees, of clouds, of the way light fell across a bench. No one clapped, no one commented, but for the first time in years, he didn't need them to. One afternoon, he found himself sitting on a bench near the library, watching two children chase a pigeon. Their laughter cut through the cold wind like a warm knife. An elderly man sat beside him, nodding politely. They didn't speak for a while. Then the man gestured toward the camera in his hands. "You shoot?" he smiled. "Not professionally. Just looking again." The man chuckled. "That's the trick, isn't it? Most people stop looking once they think they've seen it all." They talked for half an hour, about nothing and about everything, before they parted. The man said, "Solitude's not so bad once you stop treating it like punishment." That line stayed with him. At home, that night, he didn't feel quite as alone. He began calling old friends, not for reassurance, but just to listen. He signed up for a weekly writing class at the community center. At first, he didn't share much, just listened. But eventually, his words came, slow but honest. He wrote about small things, the smell of autumn leaves, the way grief returns in quiet rooms, the sound of a drawer closing in an empty kitchen. No one applauded, but a woman in her 70s, sitting beside him in the third class, touched his arm after he read one of his pieces. "That line," she said, "about how sometimes love feels like shrinking to fit into someone else's hands. I felt that." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. Something softened in him that night, not a return to the man he used to be, but the beginning of someone new, someone who didn't need to prove he was worthy of love, someone who had learned that loneliness is not the worst thing that can happen. Being unseen, even when you're standing right in front of someone, that is worse. Solitude, once unwelcome, had become a companion, not one that took the ache away, but one that taught him how to sit with it, how to breathe through the pauses, and how, in those pauses, to hear the sound of his own life again. Part 5. A different kind of strength. Winter came slowly that year. The first frost crept in like an afterthought, edges of leaves turning crisp, the morning air biting just a little deeper. He found himself walking more often now, bundled in an old coat, hands tucked into pockets, a scarf she never liked wrapped around his neck. There was a rhythm returning to his days, not busy, not loud, just steady. He made soup in the evenings, watched the birds gather at the feeder he'd set up by the window, read more, slept better. And something unexpected happened. He stopped thinking about her, not completely and not suddenly, but her voice, the one that used to live inside his thoughts, offering criticisms cloaked in concern, grew quiet. And in that quiet, something new began to grow, a different kind of strength, not the kind that lifts furniture or carries burdens for others, but the kind that allows a man to carry himself, to walk through a room and not shrink, to speak without measuring every word for how it might be received. One afternoon at the cafe, he overheard a woman at the next table sigh deeply and say, "I don't know, maybe I'm just too much for people." He smiled into his tea. He knew that feeling, the ache of wondering if the problem was who you are, rather than who you've given your heart to. He wanted to tell her, "You're not too much. You're just standing in front of someone who's too little to hold what you offer." But he said nothing. Some lessons he had learned must arrive gently in their own time. His own had taken decades. Looking back, he could see it clearly now, how he had confused patience for virtue and endurance for love, how he had worn his suffering like a badge, believing it made him noble. But love, real love, shouldn't ask you to abandon yourself to prove you're worthy. It doesn't come with rules about how much of yourself you're allowed to show. It doesn't reward silence. He understood now that there are people in this world who only know how to love on conditions, who give affection like it's a salary paid out only when you perform just right. And he had performed for far too long, but no more. The old mirror in his hallway hadn't changed. The lines on his face were still there, the gray in his beard now touched with white. But the man looking back stood taller, his eyes clearer, not because he was younger, not because he was loved again, but because he had finally remembered how to love himself. He began volunteering twice a week at a local repair cafe, helping fix old radios, lamps, even someone's vintage toaster. His hands remembered more than he expected. There was something healing in it, in restoring things that others had given up on. Sometimes someone would say, "Thank you," I thought, "this was useless." And he'd smile and reply, "Nothing's useless." Sometimes it just needs a little care. It was never really about the objects. Each screw tightened, each wire rewired was a kind of prayer. That the same could be true for people, that what is worn down can be restored, that what's been dismissed as old or broken can still hold warmth, light, music, including himself. And that kind of strength, the quiet kind, the kind that asks for nothing but refuses to disappear, was the most powerful thing he had rediscovered. Part 6. The dignity of starting again. Spring returned almost unnoticed. One morning he opened the curtains and saw that the tree outside his window, bare and brittle for months, had begun to bloom. Small white flowers clung to its branches like soft declarations. We are not done yet. He stood there for a long time, holding his coffee, letting the light spill in. There had been a time not long ago when he believed his best years were behind him, that after 70, life was more about endurance than discovery. But now he wasn't so sure, because something unexpected had taken root in him, a gentle curiosity, not just about the world outside, but about himself. Who was he now, without the need to impress, without the weight of someone else's expectations? He was beginning to find out. He took a short trip alone to a nearby coastal town, a place he'd once visited in his 30s with his children. The hotel had changed, so had he. But the sea was the same, steady, restless, always in motion. He sat for hours by the water, not needing anything from it, just watching, just being. On the third morning, a woman in a blue jacket sat beside him on the weathered bench. She didn't speak at first, just offered a nod, like a quiet agreement between two strangers who understood the beauty of silence. Eventually they talked about small things, her garden, his favorite poets, the rhythm of waves. She said her name was June, widowed, 68. Thought she'd never travel again, but decided one day to stop asking permission from grief. He liked the way she said that. They met again the next day and the one after. No expectations, no pretending, just two people sharing space, letting their stories unfold slowly like pages turned by a gentle breeze. When they parted, she said, "This was lovely." He agreed, but he didn't rush to turn it into anything more, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of being alone. He had learned that solitude, when chosen, is different than loneliness. It's not a wound. It's a well, a place to draw strength, clarity, and peace. And from that well, he had begun building something new, not flashy or dramatic, but rooted. He called his daughter more often now, not just to check in, but to listen, to laugh, to reconnect. He rejoined the local walking group and found that he enjoyed the sound of shoes on gravel and the quiet presence of others who moved at the same unhurried pace. He began writing letters, real ones with pen and paper, to old friends, not out of nostalgia, but gratitude. And in all of this, something remarkable happened. He no longer saw himself as someone who had been left or diminished or broken. He saw himself as someone who had grown, who had passed through a kind of fire and come out quieter, yes, but clearer, who now understood that the truest kind of love doesn't come to rescue or consume. It comes to witness. And the first person who must witness your life with love is you. So when people asked how he was doing, he smiled, not politely but honestly, and said, "I'm starting again." Not because he had to, but because he could. And that, he realized, was the greatest dignity of all, not in being needed, but in knowing he was enough, even when no one else was watching. Part 7. What remains after everything else falls away. The days grew longer, not just in hours, but in meaning. There was a stillness to his life now, a kind he had once mistaken for emptiness. But now he knew better. It was not the absence of noise. It was the presence of peace. He no longer measured his worth by the warmth of another's touch or the echo of someone else's approval. Instead, he found value in smaller things. finishing a book in one sitting, baking bread on a Sunday afternoon, watching the sunset, and knowing that his presence in the world, however quiet, still mattered. There were moments he still remembered her, a laugh in a passing crowd, the smell of her perfume on someone else's coat, a phrase she used to say that caught him off guard while watching a film. But memory, he realized, is not always a call to return. Sometimes it's simply the mind dusting off what it once held dear before placing it gently back on the shelf. He had forgiven her, not aloud, not in some grand cinematic scene, but slowly, by living well, by not carrying the bitterness forward. Because that was the final lesson he had learned, that dignity is not just in leaving what hurts. It's in not letting what hurt you define the rest of your story. He kept a notebook on his nightstand, now filled with fragments, thoughts, questions, little lines of reflection, not to publish, not to prove anything, just to remember, to listen to himself. One entry read, "I spent years trying to be enough for someone else. Now I am enough for the man in the mirror." Another, "They say love is sacrifice, but sometimes the greatest love is refusing to disappear to make someone else comfortable." On Tuesdays, he met June at the library cafe. They didn't call it dating. There was no need. Their time together wasn't about possession or promises. It was about presence. She once told him over tea, "You have a way of making silence feel full." He smiled. That to him was a greater compliment than anything he'd heard in years. They didn't talk about the past much. When they did, it was with soft voices and open hands. No shame, just memory, like footprints left in the sand, no longer sharp, but still there. He had no grand plan now, no bucket list, no need to chase or prove. He just lived, tended his small herb garden, attended local poetry nights, watched the neighborhood kids ride their bikes down the street, shouting with the kind of joy that only comes when you believe life is infinite. He was not infinite. He knew that. But he also knew that a life doesn't have to be long to be full, and a heart doesn't have to be young to be open. At a gathering one evening, a friend's grandson asked him, "What's the most important thing you've learned?" He thought for a moment, then said, "That being loved is not the same as being seen, and sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away, not from someone else, but from the version of yourself that forgot your worth." The boy didn't quite understand, but he nodded, sensing something true in the words. And that was enough. In te. What remains after everything else falls away is this: the quiet knowledge that you chose to stay kind, that you didn't grow bitter, that you stood back up, and that somewhere in the late chapters of your life you found yourself again, not in someone's arms, but in your own, not because life gave you everything you wanted, but because finally you stopped giving away what you always had. Thank you for joining us on this quiet journey of reflection and resilience. If this story spoke to something inside you, something unspoken, perhaps long buried, know that you're not alone. Aging isn't the end of becoming. It's a return to what truly matters. If you'd like more stories that honor the wisdom, dignity, and strength of later life, we invite you to subscribe to Grandparents' Wisdom. Your support helps us continue sharing voices that deserve to be heard. Like, comment, and share if this touched you. And remember, it's never too late to choose yourself again. See you in the next story.